Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion on prescription drug price controls. I see we still have some audience members filtering into the Zoom call, but we'll get underway in just a moment. Again, thank you all for joining us for the Competitive Enterprise Institute's latest online event, our Price Controls, a Constructive Way to Lower Prescription Drug Costs. I'm Greg Conko. I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I'll be your host for today's program. Americans spend more than $500 billion every year on prescription drugs, more per capita than any other country. And roughly half of that is spent by the federal government through programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and military and veterans health programs. Now, American patients benefit from unparalleled access to new and innovative medicines, having access to far more of them and far sooner than patients in other countries. But there's a broad view held by many that we pay too much for that access, and the government should do something to force drug prices down. Naturally, politicians from both sides of the political aisle have lined up to offer their own proposals. The leading plan today is a bill known as H.R. 3, the Elijah Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act, introduced in the House by the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Ways and Means Committee, and Education and Labor Committee. It seeks to reduce Medicare spending by requiring manufacturers to negotiate prices for a cohort of the most expensive drugs with the Department of Health and Human Services. But it caps the top end price at a benchmark rate tied to the average price in 6 countries that impose price controls. Now, House Republicans have introduced their own competing bill, H.R. 19, which takes a far more piecemeal and less radical approach. But it is worth noting that there's a surprising amount of overlap in the approaches taken by congressional Democrats on the one hand, and by the Trump administration during the past few years on the other. Both would rely on piggybacking on the price controls imposed by foreign governments to force spending down. But is the cost of prescription drugs really too high? Do Americans really pay too much? And what effect would price controls have on healthcare costs, innovation, and patient care? With us today is a panel of distinguished experts to discuss these and related questions. Richard Manning is a managing director of Intensity LLC, an economics consulting firm. He's been studying the market for prescription drugs and been involved in debates over healthcare pricing and reimbursement most of his career, including time spent with pharmaceutical companies Merck and Pfizer. James William dealt with many of these very questions as a special assistant to the president on the White House Domestic Policy Council from 2019 to 2021, and before that as an economist with the Council of Economic Advisors. And Joel Zinberg has what may be the most unique perspective. He is a medical doctor and a lawyer. He spent 2 years as general counsel and a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and we're proud to have him now as a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Now, before we begin, I should note that we'll be taking some questions from the audience later in the program. And those of you who are watching can submit a question at any time using the Q&A function on Zoom or by emailing them to events@cei.org. Now, let me begin with a pretty broad question, and I'll ask Richard to weigh in first. Richard, are prescription drug prices really too high? And how would we even go about answering that question?
Well, thank you, Greg. I do think that's a very interesting question, and one that if you ask most people, they'd say, well, of course they're too high. Everybody knows that. And unfortunately, that perception is at odds with a lot of the reality. But it is that perception that is driving a lot of the policy debate in my experience and in my perspective. So I happen to notice the Kaiser Family Foundation poll that came out just not too many weeks ago, maybe just a couple weeks ago, where they had asked people that exact question: are prescription drug prices unreasonable? And I think something on the order of 80% of people said yes, they are. But then they asked people who were actually using prescription drugs, so do you find it hard to afford them? And something like 75% said, no, it's easy to afford the drugs that I take. And so I think that is one of the main challenges we face in the policy environment, is to make sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog. And it is absolutely true that some drugs have, by any standard, what one would call high list prices, and that those get a lot of attention. So the new treatments for hepatitis C that came out a few years ago, Sovaldi and Harvoni were, began with list prices of $80,000 and per year, and that was universally or very widely seen as excessive. However, shortly after their launch, competitive forces came to play, and those prices were dramatically reduced. Now, there are other examples of high-priced drugs, some biologics, some biosimilars, some emerging new therapies that come out of the advance of science that do have very, very high prices, but those prices are also coincident with tremendous value that's provided by those drugs. So I think it is important, as we think about that problem, to understand the true nature of prices and understand the true nature of who is paying and who is actually affected by what are perceived to be high prices. Now, I want to make sure to make clear that there certainly are people, by virtue of their insurance coverage or the lack thereof, or by virtue of the particular plan they are in, who do face substantial drug spending. Now, I see that mostly as an opportunity to think about how better to provide insurance for those people, rather than to throw a blanket over the entire prescription drug sector and to perhaps do real damage to the incentives for innovation that exist in that sector.
Joel, did you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I think just to follow up on what Richard said, I think it's very important that we specify which prices are people talking about. And Richard made reference to the list prices, and that's generally speaking what most people, most newspapers that have these, inflammatory headlines are talking about. They hear about list prices are being raised by drug companies this year, but in fact, list prices are almost irrelevant. No one pays list prices. List prices are just the starting point. They're the starting point for negotiation, for rebates, for discounts that determine the actual transaction prices. And those transaction prices are really what are important. And I think it's important to also think about, when you talk about drug prices, which drugs are you talking about? So if you're talking about generics, which account for 9 in 10 prescriptions in this country, generics are actually quite cheap here. We use more generics here than they do overseas, and our prices are cheaper than the prices that people pay overseas for generics. And that's something, we may get onto comparisons with other countries later, but if you look at figure 7 that we have available, you'll see that we pay, our generic prices are, no, figure 7, please. Great, thank you, Matt. So you'll see on the right-hand side that we pay, about 84% of all other countries for generics. But then look at the countries that I think we're most comparable to, and they're listed to the left of that dark blue line, and we pay really a much smaller fraction than pay in other countries. So you can take that figure off now, please. So the affordability issues that people are concerned about are really concentrated in the drugs that Richard was talking about. What are called specialty drugs. These are very high-priced drugs, and biologics. And these are drugs that are made in living systems, and more of our drugs are falling into these categories. They're very often what are called first-in-class products because they are brand new and really unique for treating conditions that they were unavailable before. But though they're very important for funding the innovation that comes out of American companies. And I think here it's a very important thing to distinguish between the price of drugs and the price of health. And what you'll often find is that these innovative new products will lower the effective price of healthcare by introducing new products that were for previously unavailable for diseases and conditions that previously could not be treated. So, for example, Richard talked about the hepatitis C drugs as an example. Think about something like HIV, where you had a situation where prior to the introduction of new drugs, you couldn't buy life if you were infected with, if you had a case of HIV and you had a case of AIDS. You could not buy life at any price. And then these new drugs were introduced. Granted, they were expensive, but all of a sudden life could be purchased. And those drugs, just like in the case of Hep C, they came down very quickly with competition, and then eventually with the entry of generic drugs. So you see that pattern happening over and over again. More recently, there are new drugs to treat cardiovascular diseases, these PCSK9 inhibitors that are sort of an adjunct to statins. These are drugs that, again, were very expensive, $14,000 a year. The newspapers were up in arms at that list price, but the price came down very quickly with competition. And this is just competition among branded drugs. When you move into the arena of generic drugs, you see prices fall to literally, after a few generic drugs enter the market, you see prices fall into about 10% of the original branded drug price. So it's a problem, but it's a problem that seems to be concentrated in a few small areas. And I would only add that the biologics create a real conundrum for us, because to some extent they don't fall into the category of introduction of competing branded products and then eventual follow-on generics. You have a problem because these are such complex drugs, because they're created within living systems. You can't exactly replicate the molecule the way you can with small molecule drugs. So the people who try to bring on what are called biosimilars have a much harder road to get the drug approved. And then there are all kinds of questions dealing with pricing, whether they become exact interchangeable equivalents. So that's why we have only about a dozen or so biosimilars approved in this country. And at last time I looked, none of them were what are considered interchangeable the way we normally think of generics. The way you normally think of when you go to get your blood pressure medication or your statin. Unless your doctor writes dispenses written, you're going to get the generic from the pharmacist. So that's a problem with biosimilars, and it's a problem going forward.
Joel, it seems every year we see newspaper articles about pharmaceutical companies jacking prices up over and over. I mean, what's really going on in the marketplace? Is it really out of control inflation for prescription drug prices?
Well, Greg, that's an important issue, Greg, because the first question was really the absolute level of prices, and then the second level is inflation among prescription drugs. And here you find that spending on prescription drugs, and yet people have to realize that spending has multiple components. It has the price, has the quantity, and it also deals with the mixture of drugs that are on the market. But at any rate, spending on prescription drugs has been pretty stable as a percentage of overall healthcare spending. And that goes for both retail drugs and for prescription drug spending in total. So retail drugs, you're talking about 10% of overall health spending. For overall spending, you're talking on prescription drugs, you're talking about 14% of spending. That hasn't really changed much despite the entry of these new drugs. And in fact, what you can see is if you look at figure 1, that spending on prescription drugs has not been rising rapidly. So the red line on that admittedly busy graph shows you what the spending on prescription drugs has been. And if you follow that as compared to, let's say, the all items, inflation in all items, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, you'll see sometimes it's above, sometimes it's below. It doesn't deviate too far, except that in the last few years, you'll notice that it actually has dipped well below the overall CPI. And if you compare it to something like spending on medical care in general, which is the orange line, you'll see that it's consistently below. And you'll see that it's really consistently below the hospital and related services, which is, a much, in terms of inflation, it's a much, worse actor than prescription drug prices, even though prescription drug prices get all the attention. And one very important thing I want to point out is that if you look at towards the end of 2018, you'll see that red line actually dipped below zero. In other words, there was deflation in the prices of prescription drugs. And I can tell you, we noticed that when we were at CEA, and we pointed that out, and the president pointed it out in news conferences and pronouncements.
Great. So, Richard, Joel mentioned the expense and unique nature of biologics, developing them and bringing them to market. What role does R&D expense and costs play in drug pricing?
Let me answer that after I say one more thing about the pricing data Joel was going through there. One of the things that I think is important, both the fact that prescription drugs are a smaller share of the total budget than its hospital spending or spending on physicians, and the fact that the prices for some of those other services tend to be rising faster than the prices for drugs generally. So that brings to my mind a question, well, why don't people know that, or why don't they care, or why doesn't this show up in the newspaper? To me, I think it's important to recognize that everybody has a hospital nearby, or pretty much everybody. They know where that hospital is, and they think, if I ever really get sick, I want to be able to go to that hospital. I like that hospital to be good. I like it to be big and sophisticated looking. At the same time, I know who my doctor is. I may not pay the entire cost of my doctor's visit or my hospital stay, but I'm insulated to a large degree from those levels of spending. But I don't know anybody who develops drugs. I don't know anybody who, whose life would be negatively impacted on the business side if we did something like impose price controls. And so I think people are less sensitive to that, both because they're afraid of potentially not being able to afford their drugs in the future, but also because they notice and they are familiar with tangible people and properties that represent both physician spending and healthcare and hospital spending. And so they tend to be less concerned about that because they recognize, oh, there's a big building. I see how big and important and impressive it is. I want them to be able to take care of me. And I know this person who's my physician. I want him or her to be well paid so that he or she is available when I need him or her. So I think those are important things to remember. But I also think going back to your question, it's obviously many people talk about how much it costs to develop drugs, and new biologics essentially the same. It costs upwards of $1 billion. There's a wide range, but sometimes as much as $2 billion, $2.5 billion to bring a new biologic or a new drug from conception to actual approval and marketing in the marketplace. Now, that's because a lot of the products that start that process fail, and a lot of those drugs have very large expenditures in running large and complex late-stage clinical trials to demonstrate that they are safe and effective for use to the FDA's satisfaction. And so it can be a very costly and extended process to bring a new drug to market. But I think equally important, in fact, even more important from an economic perspective, is that it is the value of new products that determines its price. It's not just the cost that it took to bring it to market. If you spent a lot of money on something that wasn't valuable, nobody would buy it. And so you can't just charge a lot of money because you spent a lot of money developing it. I'm reminded of a product called Exubera that my guess is that none of us except me have heard of it. My guess is that if you ask people out in the general public how many have heard of it, most people would say no. It was a product when I worked at Pfizer as a treatment for diabetes, an inhaled insulin product that Pfizer spent many years and a lot of money trying to develop. They did bring it to market. They expected it to be a big success, but nobody bought it. It wouldn't be purchased because it didn't fit patient need as much as the company thought it would. So that's a perfect example of how value determines whether or not people will use a product. And the fact that it costs a lot to bring a new product to market, maybe there's something we could do about that, and that would be an important thing because it would allow more products to be brought to market. But because it costs a lot to bring a new drug to market, companies that develop them and investors that fund that are incentivized to focus on products that will reward that investment with a relatively high price during the period that it is covered by patents or other forms of intellectual property protection. So yeah, it does cost a lot to bring a new drug to market, but only the drugs that are worth the cost of the price that it ultimately is charged for them will succeed in the marketplace. That's pretty fundamental economics.
So James, R&D expenses are fixed costs, right? You've got a drug manufacturer has to bear the R&D expense, whether he's selling in the United States or the European Union or Japan or Australia. Why is it that prices are higher in the United States and much lower in other countries?
Sure. So especially in the OECD, you'll see a lot of price controls, external reference pricing regimes, and governments directly negotiating with pharmaceutical manufacturers on behalf of their citizens. And what's kind of unique about those regimes is that there's really no outside option. If your government negotiates a certain price, or they don't negotiate because they think the stated price is so high and they walk away and you don't have access to that product, your outside options are limited unless you're extremely wealthy. But aside from those price controls that would account for some of those differences, you also see differences in income. So if we can take a look at figure 4, for example, we'll see a wide range of differences in income to the United States, which you'll see in red, which is a relative GDP per capita. And so, Switzerland obviously above us, but the rest of these developed nations are just below. But in the blue here, you'll see a price index ratio for the top 200 selling prescription drugs for these countries. And so obviously, even though there's overall, there's a lower relative GDP per capita, what these developed nations pay for their drugs is roughly half the relative GDP, which is surprising. But it's that's largely driven by the price controls, as I discussed earlier, but also there's perhaps a lower willingness to pay for healthcare in general. If we go to figure 5, we have that as well, where you'll see here now in the red, you have relative health expenditures per capita. And so, the United States obviously values health quite a lot, but some might argue, perhaps our hospital system and other aspects of our system are, fairly high priced. But in general, I think this mostly reflects, Americans' interest in spending on their health. And the EU has a mix of lower prices due to price controls and a lower appetite for healthcare expenditures.
The price controls, willingness to pay. You mentioned that the penalty that patients in those countries often pay is that some drugs just are not available. I have some figures here. Of the 408 new medicines launched in the last decade, 86% of them are available in the United States, only 60% in the United Kingdom, and only 47% in Canada. Of those 408 drugs, 78% were available in the US within 1 year after launch, but only 41% in the UK and only 25% in Canada. I mean, is this the reality that you see with price controls and a reduced willingness to pay?
Yeah, I think it reflects the fact that pharmaceutical manufacturers are developing drugs primarily for the United States market. because of a higher willingness to pay. And then you always see companies, unless they're designing a drug specifically for a developing nation, for an infectious disease or something like that, you almost always see them apply to the FDA first for marketing approval in the United States before they then move on to other developed nations, because they've already achieved, their primary objective, which is, marketing access in the United States. And so I think, even the CEOs of pharma companies, when they're looking at where they're going to invest their R&D dollars, I think they look at a market size. If the United States market is sufficient to recoup, some of their expenses, but also, earn a decent return for their investors, then I think that's kind of the line of thinking. If they can earn then, additional, but, marginally lower returns for their investors by going to other developed countries thereafter, that's kind of nice, but it's not the sufficient requirement for them to make that R&D investment. And so you see a lot of, like you said, you see a lot of very interesting studies about lower access to drugs in other developed countries. There's a great paper by Maney at Harvard showing kind of even within the EU that if external reference pricing regimes were to be lifted, that smaller countries in the EU would see access to new drugs up to a year and a half earlier. And so that type of access and price trade-off is very real. And we see that, wherever those types of pricing regimes are implemented. And about 15 years ago, the Commerce Department did an interesting kind of study to take a look at the effect of these types of price controls on innovation. And they did a kind of an interesting simulation to see if, the OECD were to have a more market-based system like the United States, how much more revenue would pharmaceutical companies see, and therefore how much would they spend in R&D? And their estimate was in the range of about a 10% increase in new molecular entities brought to market, actually marketed, so they're successful compared to where we are today. So raising the price or having a more value-based price, as Richard was mentioning, is valuable not just for the EU, but it would also be valuable for the rest of the world because they could have access to those new molecular entities.
Great. So Richard, earlier, both you and Joel made reference to the fact that what patients pay at the pharmacy is vastly different from the list price of drugs, and even the list price of drugs is different from what insurers and hospitals pay. Could you briefly walk us through a little bit of, how do we pay for drugs in the United States? And there's the private market, there's the government market. Just briefly kind of put some context in this discussion.
Okay, sure. We do have a figure, number 6, if you could have that up. And this will look familiar to some people who think about the industry a lot. It may not look all that familiar to others. This is from the Drug Channels Institute, but there are lots of other charts just like this that show how complicated the payment and flow of funds and flow of product is, and the contractual relationships between the 5 different parties that are involved in the delivery of medicines to patients is. So you have a drug manufacturer. That drug manufacturer has relationships with pharmacy benefit managers who in many cases stand in for third-party health plans or health insurers. Those parties negotiate discounts based on formulary access, based on other elements of negotiating ability. Those then feed back to the pharmacy. The patient will pay an amount at the pharmacy that's determined by their insurance coverage and by those negotiated contracts. They very often pay a copayment. Now, if they're in a deductible phase, they might pay a larger amount, but over time they will get, as they succeed through a deductible phase, or their copayment will typically be fixed depending upon the level of formulary access that has been negotiated by those parties, the pharmacy benefit manager and the manufacturer, with the input of the third-party payer, so that co-payment structures can typically be much lower than the actual transaction price between the manufacturer and the PBM or the insurer. Also relevant, especially in the generic space, is the fact that wholesalers who take the drugs from the manufacturer and deliver them to the pharmacy very often have negotiated contracts with the pharmacy chains, so that there are payments flowing back and forth there as well. So it can be very complicated, to tell you the truth, and probably would take too long to uncover each of those negotiation steps, each of those rebates and discounts that happen through that chain. But it is clear that the net income that the manufacturer makes is relatively low compared to the list price, in the neighborhood of half, perhaps, is a good metric. It's also important to recognize, going back to maybe the first question, that the patient out-of-pocket expenditure is relatively low in most cases. A recent study by IQVIA found that 90% of people pay less than $500 in out-of-pocket payment over the course of a year. So while there are, again, this goes back to the point we were making earlier that Joel and I both mentioned about it being a focused problem, where problems exist, they exist in a relatively small part of that population. So it's important to recognize that we're not talking about a broad problem for a broad set of the population. And that, to me, suggests that we need to reform systems that allow the benefits of those negotiations and the benefits of healthcare coverage, insurance coverage, to flow to the patient more than to people who are left, and not leave that subset of the population exposed to larger out-of-pocket costs.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Joel, please.
So Greg, I did want to make one point, that to follow up on your questions, both to James and to Richard, that most people do not understand how drugs are developed and funded, and why drug development is quite different than most other industries. And drugs are really these global products that are very high research and development costs, but very relatively low marginal costs to produce. And that is basically because we regulate for safety and efficacy, and we regulate the manufacturing process too, all as a condition of market access. So it's those barriers to entry to market access that cause you to have such high prices. And as Richard alluded to, I mean, this is out of these Tufts study group, you're up to about $2.6 billion per drug that gets approved, largely because so many fail. And there's a tremendous opportunity cost for tying up your capital over 10 to 12 years needed for drug development, and foregone interest costs. So these are all important problems that create this seemingly high price. But that when people, one of the reasons that, to step back to your first question, that people think prices are so high is they say, oh, well, those manufacturers, they're just making money hand over fist. And they're thinking of it as an accounting, the way an accountant might think of it. But if you look at something, figure 2, for example, if we can bring that up, you see that, when you look at the return on investment, because as I said, this is a very high investment industry, and it's an investment in intangible capital into research and development over a long period of time, you'll see that biopharma is actually pretty low in terms of return. There are an awful lot of other industries that do better than biopharma. So people should not mistake the profit, their view of profits for, in fact, what is important in this industry because of its unique characteristics. And the reality is, as James was discussing, the U.S. accounts for roughly 50% of U.S. sales and 70% of profits from branded patents, even though it only has about a third of the OECD's GDP. So we have a situation where American taxpayers and patients are financing R&D for the world. And that's why when you have a situation where all these foreign governments negotiate, so to speak, and essentially set prices well below the market price, that you create a problem where Americans are funding all this. We're getting access to these incredible medicines earlier, and sometimes the Europeans never get access to it, but we're doing it at a certain cost. But it's also why most of the R&D is located, about 70% of worldwide R&D for pharmaceuticals is located in the United States.
Greg, I'm sorry, let me follow up on one point there that it flows from it naturally, and that is, many people will ask, well, why do companies agree to pay these prices abroad if in fact they're so low? And it gets to the fact that, as Joel was saying, the marginal cost, the incremental cost of manufacturing is cheap. So in fact, I remember a television show some years ago where there was a debate about prescription drug pricing, and one of the people working in the White House said to another, well, those drugs only cost pennies to manufacture. And the other guy said, well, it costs billions to make the first one, or maybe hundreds of millions to make the first one, and pennies to make the second one and everyone thereafter. So that because the manufacturing cost is so low, if your choice is accept a price below market rates or zero, then at the margin, you will make money at the price below market rates, and you'll also engender goodwill by providing your product to that market. Whereas if that were imposed in the US, then you would not cover those all of those fixed costs up front, and you would do real damage to the incentives for innovation. So
because we can't all be below average, right?
Right.
Only in Lake Wobegon.
Only in Lake Wobegon.
In bizarro world.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's this price discrimination that creates the incentive for companies to delay and not launch in other countries. And the reality is, if we're talking about, I don't know, Luxembourg, take even a larger, the Czech Republic, let's say, if the Czech Republic is adamant about a cost that a company cannot make money above their marginal cost, the company will walk away before they sell it there. And this will turn into an issue when you start talking about things like reference pricing.
Yeah. So this is a topic we could obviously discuss all day, but I'd like to transition now into discussing some of the proposals that have been either on the table currently or that we've addressed in recent years. I want to transition from something that Richard said when we were looking at the flow of funds graph, and that is that PBMs, insurance plans, others are actually pretty good at negotiating prices down. And I'm reminded that I've been studying healthcare policy since the early 1990s, and even way back then, reformers were talking about, well, if we just have Medicare negotiate prices, they'd be able to use their market clout and drive prices down. But an analysis by the Congressional Budget Office some years ago found that that was not really likely, because all the other large institutional purchases like PBMs and like insurance companies, like large employer plans, already have pretty substantial market clout, and they already drive prices down relatively low. So in the last few years, we've been looking at some other things, both on Capitol Hill and in the White House. I'm going to ask James, I'm going to put you on the spot since you were there when the Trump administration was discussing some of these proposals. Tell us a little bit about, if you don't mind, what was going on in the Trump administration? What things were you looking at in an effort to get prices down? And I know that there were internal debates, so I will ask you if you could maybe speak from a neutral observer point of view and not necessarily from your own perspective. You could just describe what it was the Trump administration was looking at.
Sure. So there were a number of rules that were under consideration First was the rebate rule. This would essentially remove a safe harbor for secret rebates between manufacturers and plan sponsors and the PBMs that Richard just discussed that represent plan sponsors in negotiations. And so those rebates or kind of secret discounts would no longer be allowed. And the kind of result in one of the big sticking points was that some of those rebates are used to achieve better negotiated prices for the drugs, and that results in lower premiums. And so when you kind of undo that, there was a significant concern that premiums would go up. And since Medicare premiums are subsidized by the government, that also taxpayer funding would also go up. And so those were the two kind of chief tensions for that rule in particular. There's also, we were just talking about reference pricing. Trump did propose his own reference pricing rule, the most favored nation model, which was a temporary rule, if you will, that would last 7 years and would establish an external pricing regime to get Medicare Part B, the physician-administered drugs, lowest price for the top spenders in that program. There were other programs like drug importation. There was also an attempt to get list prices on advertisements on television, which was struck down by the courts. And so there was a whole host of them. Going back to, I think, one of the first figures that Joel showed, it was actually Scott Gottlieb's reform of the generic drug approval process and standardizing that process that probably had the most substantial effect. And they went through an extraordinary backlog of pending generic ANDAs or kind of applications at FDA, and that resulted in extraordinary decreases in the prescription CPI that we had not seen before. I think if I recall correctly, it was 8 out of 12 months in 2018 saw price decreases for prescription drugs on average. Now, this is kind of a good point, I think, to bring up the fact that there, on average, I completely agree with what Joel and Richard said earlier. We're seeing price decreases from quick approvals, and some deregulation, but there are still pockets where people are really exposed to price increases, and I think that's kind of an area that has caused a lot of the kind of political desire for price negotiation. And going back to the MFN rule, that most favored nation rule that just discussed briefly, the desire there was to essentially lower the new drug prices in Medicare Part B, where essentially if there's no existing price on the market, the manufacturer can essentially state that their own price in Medicare Part B. And if you're one of the 20% in Medicare who don't have a supplemental insurance policy or low income coverage, then you're exposed 20% to whatever that stated price is. Now, some of these drugs obviously are extremely effective and could potentially save your life. But you also have situations, and Joel might be able to speak to this as well, in the oncology market where you might be going through a number of oncology drugs that aren't quite substitutable. And if you're exposed at 20% coinsurance to those, that might not seem like an affordable process.
So the most favored nation rule was the one I think that got the most publicity. It's been held up in the courts for reasons that I don't think we necessarily need to get into right now, but it looks like that's probably dead, especially since We've got legislation that is being pushed through Congress right now that would obviate the need for something like that. The worst elements of that, though, the reference pricing and tying prices to countries, prices in countries with price controls, is sort of held over in HR 3, the so-called Medicare price negotiation bill. Could you tell us a little bit about, tell us about the HR 3? What's the main couple of features that that people should know about?
Sure. So Title I, which is probably the most important part of HR 3, would empower the Secretary of Health and Human Services to establish a list of top spending drugs, and the companies that manufacture those drugs, which are single source drugs that don't have any competition, would then be required to enter into negotiation with the Secretary and come to an agreement as to what the price should be. Now, if they decide they don't want to participate in that negotiation process, then an excise tax of 65 to 95% of that product's sales would be applied. So essentially the entire market for that product would be taxed, which isn't quite a negotiation. I think some people would like to call that a true negotiation. Others, I think the analogy is probably a little bit more apt, more of a hostile negotiation. And so that's what CBO has estimated would save several $100 billion. And there are two additional titles that I'll mention that are substantive, but not quite as substantial. You have the drug inflation rebates, where if the price goes over the CPIU for price increases annually, the drug company would have to pay the Treasury the difference over that CPIU. And then you also have caps on Part D plan spending for beneficiaries of $2,000. So currently there is no true cap for Part D. Even if you reach the catastrophic phase, you're paying 5% as a beneficiary.
So you described the what is described in the bill as negotiation, as forced negotiation, and mentioned the CBO in looking at not the bill this year, but looking at the identical bill in the last Congress, found that it would reduce, or estimated it would reduce federal spending under Medicare by about $350 billion over a decade. Also found, though, that it would lead to a reduction of approximately 8 to 15 new drugs, right? So some of that effect on innovation that we talked about a little earlier with vis-a-vis price controls in other countries. I mean, is it inevitable, and I'll throw this question out for all three of you, is it inevitable that if we try to artificially lower pharmaceutical prescription drug prices, that we are going to pay a price in terms of lost innovation?
Yes, I think it is inevitable. And I do want to clarify one point. The HR 3 bill, the sort of reference price negotiation, so to speak, is dealing with Medicare Part D, whereas what Trump was dealing with was Medicare Part B. Sure. For people who don't know, Medicare Part B are drugs administered in physicians' offices, whereas Part D is what you go to your pharmacy or you mail away to your mail-in pharmacy for. And Part D is actually a substantially larger program. But I think, to answer your question, Greg, the important thing is that the estimate was 8 to 10 drugs over the next 10 years. Well, CEA looked at this, and our estimate was substantially higher, potentially as high as 100 drugs foregone, because CEA was much more appreciative of the role that pharmaceutical profits play in funding that R&D. again, the industry is rather unique in that it doesn't typically rely on outside financing. It relies on its own profits to fund its current capital. And those profits are indicative of what they foresee as future investment return, and they also provide the money to make that investment now. And if you take away that money, you take away some of the incentive going forward, but more importantly, you take away the actual capital needed to fund future development. So our estimate was substantially higher.
And one thing about Jill, sorry, Greg, let me.
Yeah, please.
That, investors do have alternatives. And so shareholders of big pharma companies or shareholders of other organizations that fund biotech and other investments, they have alternatives. And if they're not going to earn as good a return in investing in pharmaceuticals, they'll go elsewhere. So people who say that, companies will keep developing drugs because that's the only thing they can do, that's just not the model. The model is investors fund that because that's where they earn a return on their money. And there are alternatives.
So I have a couple of questions I want to try to work in now before we get back to a couple of themes that I've discussed with the speakers before. One question is, there are, even in the United States, some government programs, Medicaid, the 340B program, Veterans Administration Health Program, that already have some type of price controls. What big a percentage of the market is this, and what kind of an effect does that have on private sector drug prices? And I'll throw that to any volunteer.
Well, Medicaid in total, I think, is probably 20% or so of the market, maybe even smaller than that. In fact, it is that. No, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. It's probably more like 5 or 6% of overall drug spending. So even though you have the what's called the Medicare best price situation, which basically says that a manufacturer cannot charge more than they give as a best price to any non-governmental entity, or a fixed 23% off of the average sales price, whichever is lower. And in practice, this works out to somewhere on the order of probably about 30% off the pricing. That's a relatively small part of the market. The 340B program, which is another program where the government, similarly to the Medicaid program, requires these steep discounts when you're selling to organizations that provide backup care or charity care or care to vulnerable populations. Again, that's a relatively small and frankly abused part of the market, because there's actually very little control over who gets to qualify for 340B status. So that's why there have been a tremendous number of organizations rushing to qualify. And then those are prices on outpatient drugs, but they can use those cheaply acquired drugs for anything, and they can resell. It's almost like a guaranteed way to mint money. So that's a program that's really in need of serious reform. But as to how much it affects, both of those programs affect the remainder of the market by saying to the companies, you cannot sell too low because you will be bound by these by your low prices that you sell to private companies, which make up at least 50% of the market. You're going to be bound in these other arenas like 340B and Medicaid. So it actually probably, those function as a tax, essentially, on the price of drugs, and they probably drive up prices and definitely list prices in other areas of the market.
Another question about insulin, right? Insulin being a biologic, Joel, I think you discussed earlier. They're difficult to replicate, so you can't have true generics. They're very expensive because they're created in living cells to develop. And we've seen a lot of argument around insulin pricing. There was some of the Trump administration proposals were specifically directed at insulin pricing. Briefly, and maybe Richard, I'll ask if you're able to tell us a little bit about, what's going on with the insulin market, and are there reasonable ways of perhaps bringing that under control?
So Joel and James may have a lot more on the ground commentary on this one, but one thing, when I hear about insulin, I like to remember that, the insulin that is being sold today is not the same as the insulin that was being sold 40, 50 years ago. Everybody talks about it as though, look, it's a simple, same molecule, same substance, it helps diabetics. No, there's been a lot of innovation in lengthening the course of therapy and in facilitating the delivery devices. Now, the regulatory rules around approval for delivery devices and the combination of the medicine and the product have complicated competitive entry. But there have been some steps to limit pricing and to make to address the needs of people who are exposed to high insulin costs. And I think, again, I'm a market-based economist, and I think, or market-oriented economist, and I think that finding ways to increase competition in this sector and in all sectors is really the answer.
Yeah, I think it's relevant, as you said, that insulin's, it sounds like, well, we've had insulin on the market for 80 years, right? Initially, it was derived from live animals and then synthesized in a lab beginning in the 1980s. So we've had insulin on the market for years, so people tend to think, well, it's the same product. Why isn't it cheaper? As you mentioned, Richard, the insulins that we're talking about, cutting edge products now, the very expensive insulins are vastly different. You hear a typical response is, well, there are less expensive insulins on the market, but patient advocates will say, but those are different, right? So patient advocates themselves recognize that the products that they most want are in fact new, do in fact produce unique benefits compared to the products that were on the market 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
And as I mentioned before, one of the market failures, or one of the failures on the market, was an effort to produce an inhaled product that didn't work well. Nobody wanted to use it. It wasn't attractive enough. Yeah. And so there's been a lot of money put into trying to find out a better, more convenient way to provide this product to people.
Great. All right, so we are running out of time. I want to close briefly. I'm going to ask each of the three speakers to provide a brief answer, maybe 60 or 90 seconds apiece, if you could. We've talked a lot about why price controls are not the right answer, why there's a real penalty to be paid in access and innovation if we adopt price controls in the United States. What can be done? What would be a more constructive response? And James, it's been a while since you've had an opportunity to talk. I'll call on you first, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I think one thing I'd like to see in particular, it's maybe very much different from all of the systems we've been talking about, but we actually touched on it briefly during the Grassley-Wyden drug pricing negotiations in 2019. And this was an idea to essentially help beneficiaries smooth their out-of-pocket expenses over time. And there are a lot of reasons that this is actually a pretty challenging issue. But today, if you don't have really good health insurance, and therefore you're highly exposed to price changes in drugs or high-priced drugs, then your access to credit is only really expensive credit, essentially. Even if you have a personal health loan for healthcare, the interest rates on those are fairly high. So one thing I'd like to kind of see, and I plan on working on a little bit more, is improving credit markets for healthcare in particular, to lower interest rates and to kind of increase access to some of the ways that people can smooth out their healthcare expenditures over time, so that you still have a market-based system. You don't have to rely on price controls and caps, but you're also improving people's ability to actually afford life-saving therapies. And so that's something I think is has been underdeveloped and should be taken seriously.
Very interesting. I'd love to learn more about that. Richard?
Sure. I've already kind of foreshadowed what I think in terms of thinking that competitive forces ought to be allowed to work more freely. I would welcome efforts to reduce the cost of bringing a drug to market. That would allow more people to invest in that and allow more competition at the market level. I believe we should continue to do more to facilitate the entry and exit of generics. So there are reasons why there are many generic companies that are sitting on the sidelines and are not making the generic market quite as competitive as it could. I think that could help, and it would especially help avoid kind of the headline issues like Daraprim, where Martin Shkreli and his company were accused of trying to corner the market on that product and making the product go up sky high. If entry and exit were easier and more facilitated by the regulatory process, those kinds of things would be less common and may even go away entirely. So reforming insurance, making more competition available in insurance products and in entry and exiting the market, I think would be a good idea.
Thank you. And Joel, you get the last word.
Well, I think the message we should take away from the last few years and from that decline in drug price inflation that we saw in that original graph is that when you bring more things to market, whether they're generics, whether they're branded, you get competition, you bring down prices, and you spur innovation, and innovation that lowers the cost of healthcare. So I think one thing that needs to be considered is some sort of economic pathway for drug approval, where you're not merely looking at the clinical parameters, but you create pathways when there's inadequate competition or inadequate access to branded products in a particular therapeutic area or in generics, so that you can bring things to market quicker. And we already have some mechanisms that the FDA utilizes, various pathways that can speed things along. They're being increasingly used, but I think we have to look very carefully at things like surrogate markers and biomarkers, and those are things that are used in the accelerated approval pathway to bring things to market quicker, with the proviso that you're going to continue to monitor those products post-approval and make sure that they are indeed safe and are indeed effective. So we need to be considering those things. And I also want to make one other point that we didn't get a chance to discuss, but I think COVID has changed the way people view a lot of the drug companies, and miraculously they've gone from being just considered on a par with tobacco companies. They're now actually considered more than 60% positive approval ratings. But another thing that COVID did, which is very important, is it pointed up the vulnerability of our drug supply chain, both for pharmaceuticals and for personal protective items and medical devices. We are heavily dependent on foreigners, particularly dependent on the Chinese, who manufacture 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients. And I think as part of this debate about where we go in terms of pharmaceutical regulation, we have to seriously consider measures to bring more of the manufacturing back to the United States, even if it costs us a little more money.
All right. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today. I hope you all will join me in thanking the speakers for what I think was a very enlightening presentation. And I hope you will please consider tuning in next week, Tuesday, July 6th, for the future of ESG investing. CEI's Richard Morrison will host a panel featuring Justin Danhoff, Jennifer Schulp, and Andrew Studiford on the latest craze in what used to be called corporate social responsibility. So with that, thank you all and enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.